Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me in. I'm here from the headmaster's office, or the head of house office, rather, for Ravenclaw. In my Ravenclaw colors, I am the head of house for Ravenclaw in my own world. I have the Ravenclaw crest tattooed on my arm, so that sort of positions me for you um, in in our sort of fandom world. So um, I've got an hour with you today, and I'm going to talk about something that I've been working on for a few years. All right, so I spent a lot of time thinking about race in this series, and the thing about it is, I understand that right now, in this historical moment, um, it is fashionable is not the right word here, but it is a thing in our culture currently to sort of reject Harry Potter wholesale based on J.K. Rowling. And as I was preparing this week, I have been thinking quite a bit about how little the average person knows or cares about what's going on with J.K. Rowling right now. Um, those of us who are in that sort of Harry Potter community, the hardcores, people who study this in a scholarly way or who are hardcore fans, we are very much connected to what is happening with J.K. Rowling and her anti-trans tirades and whatnot. But then I turn on the television and there are still Harry Potter marathons, and Harry Potter is still flying off the bookshelves, and people are still wearing their Harry Potter gear. And so Harry Potter is going to be a part of our collective popular culture consciousness forever, regardless of J.K. Rowling. And so, as a rhetorician, as someone who is schooled in rhetoric, I'm used to putting her aside and not really caring about what she has to say anyway, and dealing with the texts themselves. And I think it's important that we continue to deal with the texts themselves, because these texts are going to be in our pop culture lexicon forever. And so I'm making the conscious choice to put all of her aside and to really get my fingers into the text itself, because the text continues to be instructive about all kinds of things that are going on in our society at any given point. Okay. So today what I want to talk about is biracial identity development in Harry Potter. If you cannot tell, I'm going to reveal something about myself like this much. I am biracial. And as a biracial person, I spend a lot of time thinking about what that means in the world. Monoracial people tend to not have to think that hard about race, particularly monoracial white people. As someone who is half white, I spend a lot of time thinking about whiteness because it doesn't operate for me in the way that it does for you. And so I really wanted to get my fingers into it, and lo and behold, as it does with lots and lots of things, Harry Potter becomes a very instructive way to think about being biracial in America. So when we think about Harry Potter, we usually think of Ron, Harry, and Hermione in these terms. And by these terms, I mean, one of the things that film does, one of the advantages film has, is what we call imagination colonization. That is, at some point in your life, you read Harry Potter, hopefully. You read Harry Potter without having already seen the movies, particularly if you're my age. If you're on the older end of things, you did not grow up with Harry Potter. Harry Potter came to you as an adult. And so when the Harry Potter series came out as films, these actors began to colonize our imagination spaces in such a way that for many readers, it is difficult to read Harry Potter without envisioning Daniel Radcliffe. It's very difficult to read Ron Weasley without imagining Rupert Grint, and it is, for some reason, especially difficult for Harry Potter readers to divorce themselves from Emma Watson. And so this attachment that we have to these actors and to this universe has really influenced the way that a lot of readers read the series, which is why I think that it's fair to say that we don't deal very well with the actual actors of color in this series, of which there are several. They are almost all minor characters, depending on what we mean by minor. And while characters like Dean Thomas appear in every book, Dean Thomas is by no means a central character to the narrative. Not in the way that someone like the Weasleys are, for example. So, or Luna Lovegood for that matter. We could talk a little bit about this character in particular. Oh, you know what? I'm sorry, I skipped. I'm gonna backtrack. The Harry Potter narrative has been used as a model to explain identity. Let me just say that in a myriad of ways. Harry Potter has been used as an example of how white privilege works. As Karen told you about earlier, I did that work 2 years ago. How gender operates in contemporary society. A lot of my work is around gender. How society deals with issues of adoption or child soldiers or sexual orientation presentations, class relations, and more. Because the series is written by a white British woman, the default lenses through which we interpret the narrative are often white and British and female. However, the transitive nature of fiction provides us with an opportunity to branch beyond those default lenses and to consider the text in other constructs. So, within Harry Potter studies, one of the most universally accepted interpretations of Rowling's work is that she does not deal directly with race. And the rationales for this vary, obviously, but the point itself is that it's largely unchallenged. Race is largely unchallenged in Harry Potter studies literature. Race in the Potterverse is simply not talked about. And while we know that there are a variety of racial groups present in the wizarding world, as I was just saying, there are white wizards and black wizards and Indian wizards and Asian wizards that we know of. Rowling specifically avoids racial categorizations for most major characters. Even when explicit, the race of many major characters is only hinted at through inference. For example, Ron's entire family, as I was just talking about, is categorized, physically described in the text as having red hair and pale skin, so we can presume this family is white. Luna Lovegood, similarly, is described as having white blonde hair and blue eyes, which leads us to categorize her as white. However, most characters in the series are given ambiguous racial descriptions at best. And the films have exacerbated all of this discussion over racialized characterizations. For example, when in the first few films, Kathleen Colley and Jennifer George, both of whom are Black actresses, were replaced with Jessie Cave as Lavender Brown, in the role of Lavender Brown. And this switch was particularly egregious due to the fact that neither Colley nor George had a speaking role in either of these films. But suddenly in Half-Blood Prince, when Lavender Brown is required to both speak and share love scenes with Ron Weasley, the actress portraying her was recast as white. And recently, many people within Harry Potter fandom have adopted the notable racial characterization of Hermione Granger as Black. Because Hermione's race is never explicitly stated in the text, many fans argue that Hermione could very well be Black. A theory then supported by Rowling herself, with the endorsement of the casting of a Black actress to play Hermione in stage productions of Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. Now, it is fair to say that when Cursed Child opened in June of 2016, I think it's entirely fair to say that white folks lost their minds. Now, this is by no means exclusive to Harry Potter fandom. And honestly, I, both as a scholar and as a biracial Black presenting adult American, was not surprised at all. There is a commonly held, deeply rooted belief in Western culture, particularly and specifically in the United States, that unless the author specifically says a character is not white, then they are. Non-white characters have always had some form of description to make sure their non-whiteness is made clear, usually via description of skin tone or skin color. But it becomes problematic when there isn't a comparable descriptor for any of the white characters. The absence of that description, which is really the absence of race, is the trigger for the reader to assume that character is white. And when authors avoid physically describing a character's whiteness, but put effort into pointing out characters' non-whiteness, what they are really doing is increasing the invisibility of whiteness, standardizing it, and then making white the norm and making everyone else the other. But many readers, including myself, have been remarking for years and years that there is no a priori reason at all why we have to read every Harry Potter character as white. Hermione Granger, in particular, has very little physical character description given of her, ever. Big brown eyes, lots of bushy brown hair, big front teeth, and a bossy sort of voice. That's it. You know who else has big brown eyes, lots of bushy brown hair, big front teeth, and a bossy sort of voice? My 14-year-old daughter. Reading Hermione Granger as Black has no fundamental altering effect on the story, except that it has a huge fundamental altering effect on the story. It repositions the intellectual center of the narrative as one of Black female empowerment. So reading Hermione Granger as Black reminds us that in this fictional world, in a world of fantasy and magic, whiteness as default is neither necessary nor, to be frank, particularly imaginative. As with most things these days, we don't need J.K. Rowling's permission or approval to envision the text in whatever ways we want. We don't need her amen. So, because actual physical race is not explicitly dealt with within the narrative, racial conversations in Harry Potter happen around bloodline. Bloodline is an identity struggle with both racial and socioeconomic considerations. Much as in our regular world, much as Jewish in contemporary society is not simply a racial categorization, but a religious categorization as well. And it's often tied to socioeconomic status. In the wizarding world, there are clear designations for those born of two wizarding parents, pureblood, and those born of two muggle parents, mudblood. Those of pureblood status, like the Malfoys, are afforded particular types of privilege within wizarding society, while those of mudblood status are subjected to racial slurs, mockery, and eventually even persecution, torture, and death. There is an easy parallel to be made between pureblood status as a model of white privilege and mudblood status as a model for people of color of a variety of racial groups. That brings me to the curious case of the half-blood. Following the same logic, a half-blood in the wizarding world operates much in the same way that being a biracial person operates in contemporary society. That is to say, for those of us who were born to parents of two different races, the similarities to Harry Potter's experiences as a half-blood within wizarding society abound. At the very most basic, most biracial people have experienced being called half-breed at least once in their lifetimes, sometimes many times, oftentimes by people in your own family. However, the similarities extend well beyond that. Following how Harry's biracial identity operates may shed some light on the identity development of biracial people in the real world. Note that Root points out that identity development is a lifelong, fluid process. There is no endpoint at which one is done developing. Stage models, which frame identity development as linear chronological processes, presume that there is one healthy integrated identity that perfectly merges both sides of a person's biracial identity. These have largely been rejected by contemporary literature as outdated and inapplicable in discussions of multiracial identities. This is also a good time to stop and point out that the way that blood status is conceived in Rowling's canonical work, and we could talk about what we mean by canonical, Lauren and I could do that all day. You don't want in on that fight, trust me. But the way that blood status is conceived in the canonical work is murky at best, much like, if we're being honest, it is in the real world. For example, two wizarding parents, pureblood. Two muggle parents, mudblood. One wizarding parent, one muggle parent, half-blood. But what if both parents are wizards, yet one parent themselves was muggle-born and the other parent was pureblood? Is the child still then half-blood, or is he now 1/4 muggle? This has real-world application as well. Historically, in the United States, the one-drop rule was used as a standard for white identity. One drop of African blood could make one Black by legal definition. Society's fear of racial pollution was also acutely reflected in Hitler's Germany. First, biracial people are given very little choice in how they are identified. I do not get to identify as white, even though I'm half white, because I don't look white. So therefore, I don't get to be white. Any person with non-white ethnic features, like me, or traceable non-white blood is considered non-white. This method of irrational, incomplete racial classification has made identity resolution for the biracial individual very difficult and very oppressive. So, for purposes of this argument, Harry's muggle-born mother and wizard-born father qualify him, so to speak, as the wizarding world's equivalent of biracial. Just as in the real world, the identity boxes that we all must fit into are often oddly shaped and kind of stupid to conform to society's demands. Maria Root also points out that the awareness of otherness or ambiguous ethnicity begins when a child starts to be aware of color, or in Rowling's world, blood status. From the moment Harry enters Hogwarts, he is immediately thrust into a world which he didn't even know the difference existed, but he is quickly brought up to speed. As he waits to enter school for the first time, Draco Malfoy, only the fourth student he has formally met since leaving London, says, "You'll soon find out some wizarding families are better than others." This statement could certainly be read as classist, but takes on more of an intersectionally racist tone with the caveat, "My father told me all Weasleys have red hair, freckles, and more children than they can afford." As has been covered extensively in the Harry Potter studies literature, the Weasleys serve as a very internally British narrative about English racist attitudes towards the Irish. But Harry's introduction into the otherness felt by families of the wrong sort is exacerbated in Chamber of Secrets, where we hear this epithet, "You filthy little mudblood," hurled at Hermione Granger by Draco Malfoy. Both Harry and Hermione necessitate explanation because the racial slur is not a part of their lexicon, having been raised outside of wizarding society. Mudblood is a really foul name for someone like me, someone who is Muggle-born, non-magic parents. There are some wizards, like Malfoy's family, who think they're better than everyone else because they're what people call pure blood. It's a disgusting thing to call someone. Dirty blood, see? Common blood. It's ridiculous. Harry learns to parse the experiences of his best friends versus his own. He is not a pureblood like Ron Weasley, but neither is he a mudblood like Hermione Granger. He is half-blood. This then is also paralleled in his best friend's lived experiences as well. Harry is not black like Hermione Granger, but neither is he white like Ron Weasley. What? Interestingly, because of Rowling's intentional diversion away from explicit characterizations of race, we know nearly nothing about James Potter, including his real-world racial identity. Lily Potter's is clear. Both she and Petunia are given clear markers of racial identity. James Potter is not. For example, for the first time we ever see Lily and James Potter, their descriptions are clear. Harry sees them in the Mirror of Erised, and he says, "She was a very pretty woman. She had dark red hair, and her eyes are just like mine," Harry thought, edging a little closer to the glass. Bright green, exactly the same shape, but then he noticed that she was crying, smiling but crying at the same time. The tall, thin, black-haired man standing next to her put his arm around her. He wore glasses, and his hair was very untidy. It stuck up at the back, just like Harry's did. There's no indication whatsoever in those sentences that James Potter is white. James Potter is tall. He wears glasses, and he has untidy hair. That's it. End of description. Delving deeper into the narrative, it makes sense. A lot of sense that James Potter existed as a non-white person. It also gives greater significance to the mantra of everyone who meets Harry. Harry is given continual reminders throughout the series. I expect you're tired of hearing of it, but you do look extraordinarily like James, except for the eyes. You have your mother's eyes. That's what Dumbledore says in Prisoner of Azkaban. The indication of Harry's mother's eyes, of Lily's eyes, takes on an entirely different connotation when connected to the concept of biracial identity. As multiracial heritage is the only genetically possible way for dark-skinned people to inherit green eyes, this combination of features would be constantly striking to people around Harry, much as it is in real life. I'm going to let this slide sit for a minute and let you take that in. This biracial identity also manifests itself in the way in which James is treated and spoken about by particularly Marge Dursley, who has no frame of reference to attack James on the basis of his wizarding blood status. But it certainly sounds like a very familiar string of racist diatribes about brown-skinned people. diatribes which manifest in all sorts of behavior towards Harry that certainly could be characterized as racist. Aunt March strikes Harry with her walking stick when no one is looking. She brings him dog biscuits for Christmas. She constantly refers to him as boy rather than his given name, which is an immediately recognizable racist tactic to anyone who has ever actually suffered its use. You don't call brown-skinned people boy, and yet some people do. Marge consistently advocates that her brown-skinned nephew be beaten and that it was damn good of Vernon and Petunia to keep him. But Marge really hits her racist stride like most racists do when the liquor starts flowing. Here she claims that Harry is rotten on the inside and is the result of violating one of the basic rules of breeding. She calls him underbred and says that James was a wastrel, a no-account, good-for-nothing, lazy scrounger who tricked Lily into becoming a bad egg. Marge says it all comes down to blood. Bad blood will out. Now, I'm not saying nothing against your family, Petunia. James's bad blood has tainted her family, and the result is the brown-skinned boy standing in front of her, since Bad Egg Lily ran off with the wrong sort. It is not difficult to imagine at all that Harry's persecution for his blood takes on completely different but entirely racist overtones in both worlds that he inhabits. Now, there is an argument to be made that Marge's comments are purely classist by nature, that within the context of the British class system and whiteness, lower class white blood has historically also been seen as very dirty, especially compared to middle class white Brits who aspire to be or functionally see themselves as being a higher class category than they really are. But that presumes an all-white British society, which, given the history of British colonization and subsequent immigration, literally does not exist. It also relies upon the inherently racist presumption that pervades modern popular culture that, as we said earlier, if the text doesn't explicitly state otherwise, all characters are automatically white by default. That is patently ridiculous. It's an outdated notion that is necessary for an immediate belief that James Potter, or Harry for that matter, is automatically white, especially since we're never actually told by the text that those characters are white, nor can we infer it by contemporary British society or even British society as it existed in 1980 when Harry was born. Brown-skinned people, particularly people from India and Pakistan and Northern Africa, have been a significant part of mainstream English society for most of its modern history, certainly since the mid-1900s. Root's identity model shows that there are 5 types of biracial identity resolution for those with mixed race identities. 5 ways in which mixed race individuals come to understand their own identities. First, an individual may choose to accept the monoracial identity society assigns, like the one drop rule. So I look like this, so I'm black, because that's what society says I am, so that's what I am. Second, an individual may actively choose to accept a monoracial identity and actively reject the other. So now not only am I black, but I don't even talk about my white side, and whiteness is not a part of who I am at all. Third, an individual may choose to define his or herself as biracial or multiracial, as I do. Fourth, an individual may choose to develop a new racial identity, rejecting a fractured labeling, not fracturing oneself into parts, but seeing themselves as something totally new. I have a lot of friends who refer to themselves as Blasians or Blaxicans, and that's common. They just invent a new thing. Finally, an individual may choose to pass as the dominant racial category, rejecting all heritages of color. If you have light enough skin, You just pass as white and you don't really talk about it very much. In Harry Potter, we see many of these identity choices represented among half-bloods throughout the series. For example, Severus Snape chooses to pass as pureblood for the majority of the series, ingraining himself in Voldemort's racist regime. Voldemort himself chooses a monoracial identity, actively rejecting his Muggle heritage. By the end of the series, Harry has essentially developed his own racial identity that is integrated, rejected fracturing labeling, but has done so both in terms of his blood status and in terms of his actual racial identity. He has come to terms with his biracial self, marrying his white girlfriend and raising their multiracial children without commentary, alongside his white brother-in-law and black sister-in-law raising multiracial cousins of their own. It is vital that we continue to challenge the notion that everyone within the Harry Potter narrative is white by default, not only because it poorly reflects the reality of the world, but because it is emblematic of the kinds of racist common sense that pervades every aspect of Western popular culture. In particular, white monoracial narratives are openly discussed, and the space in which those of us of bi and multiracial backgrounds are allowed into the conversation at all is mostly non-existent. James Potter and his son Harry serve as an easily understandable model for our real lived experiences as biracial people, and an entree for monoracial people to begin the process of considering the fact that we exist in the world. So that is what I got.